Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Large Format Photography Podcast. My name is Simon Forster and I'm joined by my co-host Andrew Bartram and our guest Richard Pickup. Hello Andrew.
Hello Simon.
And hello Richard.
Hello there.
Right, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to Greg Obst for being our guest in episode 9. Really enjoyed that chat, Greg, so thanks for being with us. And now we've got another guest with us, and it's somebody that Andrew brought to my attention because he sent me a link to a recent blog post which was all about simplifying the zone system. And as Andrew has made many attempts to teach me the zone system and it's just not worked, I think he sort of gave up and delegated the task out. And I've read this article and I've got to say it does actually make things slightly more clear. Yeah, so I think we might be having we might be talking a fair bit of zone system today, but the person behind this blog is with us and he's got a lot of other things that we want to talk to him about as well. So perhaps Andrew, you might want to give Richard a proper introduction.
Certainly, I'd love to, but it's taken 9 shows, Simon, to begin to get the shine. I can't even say it. You know, that Scheinflug principle. I think we finally nailed it with Wayne, maybe. I think with the aid of a beer mat. So don't lose heart. That we'll get the zone system into that Stokey noggin of yours eventually. So, but what better way than to have a teacher of photography on the show? Because clearly, none of us can explain it to you in a way which is simple enough. So I'm very pleased to welcome Richard Pickup to the show. Hello, Richard.
Hello, Andrew.
Now I've known virtually Richard for a while on Twitter. I think we've decided that's probably where we started interacting. Richard is always very generous and interactive with folks on Twitter. So if you don't already follow Richard on Twitter, do so, because he has a really great blog as well, which we'll come to. So let me give you a bit of an introduction to Richard, and I'm going to use some of his bio from his website. So Richard is first and foremost a teacher of photography, and he has a day job doing just this. That's at the South Staffs College, University.
College, further education college. Okay.
Yeah. But apparently it was not always thus. You taught art and photography history and theory to a wide range of students. And you have a degree in fine art. Oh, well, maybe you can tell us what that is. And an MA in the social history of art. Wow.
So I get fine art and the zone system.
Yeah, there'd be no bullshitting you, will there, on this show? I better be quiet. And Richard, why don't you, so that's enough to be going on with. Why don't you, in the time-honoured way, tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are and your love of photography? Because I know the love of photography flows through your veins like words through a stick of rock.
Yeah, that's a long, convoluted story. In a nutshell, it was being introduced to photography when I was a college student, and then using it in my fine art degree, and then ending up teaching it after I'd done my master's and a period of teaching art history and critical theory. So I kind of went fine art history and theory, and then to a further education job, which was much more practical based, and started teaching darkroom at that point. So that was about 2007. I would have started teaching darkroom.
But you'd been working in the darkroom and using film for a long time.
To Nottingham-Trent University to do a fine art degree there, and they had great dark rooms which were always open and you could just help yourself. And that was really.
Is that when it was Nottingham-Trent University or Trent Poly?
It was Nottingham-Trent University by then, but not long gone over, I don't think.
My wife went to Trent Poly. That's the only reason I was saying.
Yeah.
So you were using film when you were knee high to a grasshopper. Yeah,
I think. When did I? It's one of those questions, isn't it? I had a camera when I was a teenager. I think a functioning camera. I remember getting a plastic camera when I was very young and feeling very frustrated that this plastic thing didn't work.
Oh, I use plastic cameras all the time. They still don't work.
Not even one of those.
No, that's not true. I love my Holgers. So it's wonderful to have you, because we can now ask you all about the zone system. Because well, we might as well start there. Simon's already made reference to it, but why we have actually got a question. Why don't we launch into this topic, which I'm sure we can discuss for the next 6 hours. Let's break podcasting records. And we have a question from. In fact, we've had 2 questions. Before I move on to the zone system, can I just make reference to one that we've had for a couple of shows now that we haven't yet addressed, and we're not going to address it this time either. So Monty Craig, if you're still waiting for us to answer your question about lenses, hold fire, my friend. If you've gone out and bought these lenses that you're asking us about, well, that's all well and good, but we will get round to answering your question, because we're going to have Jason Lane on the show soon, Simon.
Yeah, soon. It's just tying a date down where we can all get together.
Yeah, maybe he'll even be the next one on. We don't know yet. But Jason knows all about lenses. So in the same way that Richard knows all about the zone system. So no pressure there.
Well, I was going to say, to ramp up the pressure on that one then, Jason Lane's designs lenses for a living. That's it. So
and Richard teaches the zone system for a living.
Exactly, yeah. So
I've never taught the zone system, actually.
Oh, don't say that. Okay.
Well, not all of it anyway.
Well, you did a blog post on it, so you're the closest thing to an expert that we've had on the show. So let me read this question. I don't know whether to. So it's in 3 parts. Maybe I'll just read the first part out. Yes, I think so. So, James Thorpe. Yeah, he's our great contributor to the show. Greetings, large LFers. Oh, there. I've failed at the first LFers. Yeah, large formatters. That'll be us. Really looking forward to further discussion on the zone system. I'm still quite muddy on the topic. Well, James, maybe you're placing your shadows in the wrong place. So here are a few questions. Did you like that?
Yeah.
So here are a few questions to further demonstrate my ignorance. There are no ignorant questions, James. Please, they're all great questions.
Ignorant answers.
So I think I've already asked them all, haven't I?
So, number 1, Ansel, Adams presumably, developed and printed his own work. I don't. I send my film out to a lab I trust. Since I therefore have limited control over how my film is processed, should that change how I use the zone system and interpret its scale for my desired results? So I think what he's saying there is, I'm assuming he's referring to large format, but maybe he's looking at other formats as well. And that's kind of interesting because, how can we perhaps, for those listening who use medium format or even 35mm, it's not out of this world to apply some of the zone system. So, Richard, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So I think the problem here, and I think James is realizing this, is that part of the zone system is to do your own processing, so you can change the processing to suit the exposure. So if you're sending it off to a lab, then obviously you're relinquishing part of the control of the zone system. And I think looked at in one way, ideally you would have every bit in place. You would be in control of every part, because that's part of the reason for doing the zone system. Having said that, I think if you've got a lab, he mentions a lab that he can trust, I think, didn't he say in there? So if you can work with your lab, then you can use a zone system, but there is a bit of a danger because you're giving part of it over to somebody else.
So maybe
too abstract.
Yeah. So maybe let's take a step back and perhaps explain to us, if you could, the role that development plays in the zone system. And the other bit, of course, is exposure. They're the two factors, really, aren't they? I suppose exposure,
that's it.
Exposure and development.
What development allows you to do is I wrote about it in the blog post. There's a characteristic of film, which is that your highlights will take longer to develop than the shadow areas. Because if you imagine a piece of film, the shadow areas haven't had as much exposure, and the lighter parts of your scene, that creates more density in the film. So the denser parts take longer to develop when you process. So you can exploit this in two ways. You can curtail development, you can reduce it and bring highlights down in tone, or you can take mid and light tones and you can process for longer and make those tones lighter. But you're doing this ordinarily, you're doing your own processing. So the results that you're getting are your results. So
you're advocating some testing, I would imagine, with your...
Yeah. So
because presumably if you just if you just keep overdeveloping, eventually you'll push those highlights to a portion on that sort of film development curve where you just no longer see any differentiation in tone.
That's it. And I think there's an obsessive aspect to the zone system
involving densitometers.
Well, yeah, there's that. But I think even doing a sort of a fairly rudimentary type zone system does involve quite a lot of hard, repetitive work. So if you're not into that, you know, it might not be for you, I suppose. But you're right.
But do you not think as soon as anyone starts talking about pushing and pulling and throwing those things around, and aren't they immediately, with even unconsciously using the zone system?
So I think in a way for James there's two answers. There's the strict technical answer, which is that he's relinquishing a part of the control that he would ordinarily have if he develops his own film. But the other answer is a looser one to say, well, you can use a zone system to improve your understanding of exposure, and you can use aspects of it. You don't have to, you know, necessarily have the rigor of everything to get something out of it. So
would it be fair to say for James that if he's sending his film off to a lab, there are some things he could say? I mean, he could say, for instance, this was a very contrasty scene, and the difference in light levels between the darkest and the highest was 10 stops.
Yeah.
What could he say to the lab in that situation?
He could say, give it reduced development. So he could say that, and they'll probably have some ballpark figures for doing that. Because in the zone system, we talk about N being normal development, and then N plus and N minus for adding and subtracting development. So they'll probably have, you know, rough ideas. But the trouble is, they will have their standardized ways of processing film. It depends on the film. It depends on their processing.
Yeah.
Depends on how bespoke that is.
And to be truthful, you individuals would need to determine what is inverted commas N development for themselves. So maybe we've sort of jumped in, and I understand why James is asking this question. But really, the question should start, I would think, at the other end, because the first step in this process is to determine your exposure. And again, we're talking. There are some simple and indeed complicated zone system tests. So I know, Richard, it's all about placing shadows. I know it's all about zones. I know it's about testing. So how would you, if somebody is new to this and they wanted to try and get an understanding of how to use the zone system for exposure, and they hear us talking about placing shadows and into zone threes, but they're just finding that, I don't know, their zone 3 where they were expecting some detail is blank film.
Yeah.
You know, so where do they start on exposure placement and determining whether a zone 3 really is a zone 3?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think you can do a series of tests just to work out your kind of film speed. So that's probably a place to start. So with a simple setup, I think I've got some images in my blog. So I've got a sort of setup of bits of card and things.
People use textured grey towel, don't they, or textured white towel or something?
That's in John Blakemore's book, isn't it?
Is it? I don't know.
Likes a towel.
Yeah.
Because of the texture in it, rather than just a grey card.
Yeah.
But I set up a scene of different, shadow areas, mid-tones, and some light white bits of polystyrene and things to give me a range of tones.
Yeah.
I just shot that at different film speeds. So keeping the shutter speed the same, using my 5.4, and then just changing.
So you're metering the subject and just taking an average reading? So is that?
I was just going from the grey card and just starting there. And then it's just seeing where that falls. So
hang on. Grey card? What are you talking about with the grey card?
18% grey. So in the zone system, what we do is we divide tones into areas of tone. So a scene really is made up of an infinite, it's an analog thing, isn't it? It's made up of an infinite array of tones. But in the zone system, we say we have effectively, it's nine zones that we label, but you don't really get 9 zones because 9 is pretty much white and 0 is pretty much black. And so we divide, what we're seeing into those equivalent tones. So zone 5 is that 18% mid grey. And you can actually buy a grey card, which is, it's calibrated at that mid tone.
I'm just going to say, if I can just jump in there, this was something, 18% grey has been something that's confused me for a very long time. Yeah. And I think it's that term 18% grey, because it's in my mind, a mid grey says it's 50% grey, but in reality it's not. So I don't know if you can actually explain the difference between how my mind is working and why 18% grey is a mid value.
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
I'm sure I've read about it, but I can't remember what the answer is. It's to do with transmission densities and reflection levels. Yeah. Can't you just accept it, Simon?
Well, that's the thing.
In fact, I tell you what, there's a very clever chap out there, and his name is Cetine or Cetine.
Oh, Catine.
Yeah, however you pronounce it. I think. And he always took issue with that 18% and says actually it's 13%.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's the thing about it as well that's worth remembering, though. In a way, these are they're not fictional values, but they're only real in your negatives and in your prints, if that makes sense. I think people kind of think there's some sort of magical standard that they're not reaching. And the thing about the zone system is it's about getting a handle on the way that your prints ultimately are coming out. So it's about, you being able to say a mid-grey, when I expose something, that mid-grey that I think in my mind's eye that I'm getting, perhaps getting onto visualization a bit here, but that mid-grey is going to be something like I see in my print and I take to be that mid-grey.
Yeah, I get. I'm actually. Something else has just come into my head there, which may be helpful or may not be. But when we talk about this 18% grey, and we're saying that the meter is trying to turn everything into 18% grey, which is, I'm sort of still trying to get my head around what that even means.
Yeah.
But the other part is, if you and where you can actually see this really happening is when you're taking a picture of something that is white, and this is one of the things that's in your blog post, which I thought was really, really good. I'm sure it's been done many times before, but I actually understood it when I actually read your blog post, that you if you meter for a white wall, and let's just say all things are equal, and the film is at the right exposure index, and it's processed as exactly as it should be. That white wall won't be white when you get your photograph back; it will be grey.
Yes,
it'll be 18% grey.
Yeah, and that's really important to understand that, because you can't understand the principles of placement and fall of tones if you can't get your head round that relationship between metering and that mid-grey.
See, Simon, Ansel Adams talks about determining the point in the scene in front of him where he wants to see some basic detail, and he nails that, and that becomes his base exposure. So forget anything, and then the highlights, he would then meter the highlights, and he would use that term that Richard just used. The highlights are then falling on in these other relative tones. So if it's a very dull and misty scene, let's just say, and it's very little difference between shadows and highlights, he might be exposing his film to place his shadows in an area where he wants to see some detail. And when he meters for the highlights, there only could be maybe 1 or 2 stops above. Whereas in his mind, he's visualizing them as sort of luminous highlights.
Yeah, so that's really well put. Yeah.
So then we don't need you on the show, Richard.
No, you can do it without me. It's fine. You've got it.
So Richard would. So Ansel would then want to. In his mind's eye, he's visualizing these luminous highlights, but he knows the highlights are falling, and they're going to be a muddy grey. So he's going to then want to tweak his development, because by extending his development, he would know that he really wants them to be 2 more stops further up. Instead of falling on, say, zone 5, he wants them on zone 7 or possibly zone 8.
Yeah.
He would mark his film or his sheet as that requires n+2. Now he would arrive at n+2 by testing and that's the balls ache bit of it that I can never be bothered with.
Yeah, that's the repetitive bit, isn't it? And the rigorous bit. See, for me, because I teach and I'm here in an institutional darkroom every day, I can do bits and pieces as I go along over a long period. So to bring this discussion back to the who I am bit, it kind of suits my way of working, because I can do a little bit and leave it, and then a little bit and leave it.
Yeah, and students can go away and think about it. They can go away and play with it, come back and ask a supplementary question, develop the story.
Yeah.
So Ansel Adams would know that by looking at the scene in front of him and placing his exposure. Where would he be? What does he mean by why is he looking to place his exposure anywhere? What's all that about?
So the placing is, you only have one choice, don't you? You only have one aperture and shutter speed combination, which is exposing the whole scene.
No matter how clever your camera is, how many exposure modes it's got, it's still going to set a shutter speed and an aperture. Yeah,
and that's photography in a way, isn't it? I mean, a friend of mine says this: photography is aperture and shutter speed. That's what it comes down to. And what you've got to remember is that Ansel is using a spot meter, so he can look at different areas and see how bright they are relative to one another. So then, if he chooses, it's back to that white wall thing. If he chooses one surface and meters from that, and then simply takes that reading and develops at that point, he'll get a mid-grey for that area. But then
even though he's using it, so people would see a spot meter as being a very clever meter, but actually you have to use them really carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's certain tricks with them and certain things to do and not do.
How are you getting on, Simon, with your spot meter? What are your main issues with spot metering? Because you've been out doing some waterfall photography, and I saw a post on the Lensless large format photography podcast Facebook group that you'd you'd got it in your head that you were going to meter from a certain area in the scene, weren't you?
That's right. I was out. Was it last Sunday or the Sunday before? Can't quite remember now. But I was out with Mikkel Tekel. I've been out a few times in the past shooting with a Hasselblad, and this time he's been a listener to this podcast, and now he's had to go out and buy a large format camera. So I felt obligated to go out with him when he said, "Should we go out shooting?" So, well, I better do now. You've bought a large format camera, and we went to a place in the Peak District, which is a nice part of England, and there was a waterfall scene in a forest. And say a scene, there are lots of opportunities to take photographs in this place, and just keep on walking, and there's another shot, and I decided that I wanted to get quite a moody looking scene, and I wanted to effectively underexpose my photographs.
So what were you? So you were visualizing a certain image in your mind, Simon, were you?
Yes.
And was this an image that was predominantly with darker tones and a little bit of highlight? Is that what you're talking about? Are you looking for detail in the shadows or blocked up shadows?
The problem is, because I'm also a digital shooter, I sort of want it all.
Mm-hmm. And I was just trying to understand what you meant by moody. You see, because it's about visualizing something and trying to end up with that.
Well, it's a case of I wanted very deep blacks. And I wanted almost, but not quite, blown highlights in the. Because we're talking about long exposures, and it was I wouldn't call it quite dimly lit scene, but the light wasn't particularly great, and I decided, well, what I'll do, I'll meter on the area where it's already quite dark. It's an area where perhaps I might think is already zone 3, if you like, and where there's
so Simon, now you're using terminology now without explaining yourself. So what's zone 3?
Zone 3. My understanding of zone 3 is a deep shadow area where details can still be seen.
Okay, very good. Yeah, carry on.
That's good. I passed that test.
Passed the test.
Yeah. And then I was thinking, well, I'm not interested in the detail in that scene. I want to turn that black.
Yeah.
And
that's a perfectly valid judgment to make. I was just telling you. So you don't, you don't have to have all shadow. You don't have to do it this way. You can, but the zone system allows you to control and have some understanding. If you say you want those shadows to be black, well, how do I meter to achieve that? Yeah. And that's that's where the understanding of placing your exposure comes.
Or in my case, potentially running before I can walk.
No, it's good. No, it's good. You're learning.
So for you, Simon, so for you, you're metering from that scene and then taking it down 2 stops.
Yeah, and that's what you're that's what you're practically doing, isn't it? From a practical point of view, you're metering that black scene, or that which you've decided you want it to be featureless black. Let's say.
That's right.
Which is, as I say, a perfectly valid position to take. And so you would meter it, which would give you, if you just set your camera to that exposure, you'd get a very open shadow.
Yes.
Very open shadow, sort of mid-grey open shadow, which could also be what you wanted. But because you then chose to reduce the exposure, you're shifting the tonality down and down and down. And at some point, probably 3 to 4 stops, you would definitely be deep black.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the theory.
So what did you do?
Well, that was exactly what I did. And Mikkel wasn't shooting that way. He was effectively shooting it, let's say, conventionally, and his timings were literally 2 stops higher than mine.
Mm-hmm.
So that
kind of made sense, didn't it?
Exactly. Although when we were chatting about that, when I told him this, he got quite worried. I was thinking, "How come you're down there?" And I said, "Oh, I'm underexposing by 2 stops." Ah, right, okay.
Well, no, you're not underexposing by 2 stops.
You're choosing to expose it there.
Oh, yeah.
And also, remember, your meter and his meter could easily be a stop apart from each other. So comparing numbers is quite frankly, it's not really meaningless. But I mean, I wouldn't lose sleep over that.
Yeah,
you know.
But it certainly made, I think both of us felt better that the methodology that we were both using coincided with each other, at least anyway, for what we were deliberately attempting to do. Now, where this fell down, and I've been rightly criticised by everybody, I think Wayne's told me off as well, is that what I didn't do is measure the difference between the area that I measured, which is what I believed to be in zone 3, and then to see what the highlight measurement would be. So I didn't actually know what the range is, and the reason why that was important, because the question that I asked was because I had an opportunity to develop these last Tuesday at the Six Towns Darkroom, and there was a range of developers available to me. So I asked the question: this is the scene. I want these blacks, this area is circled to be black, but I don't want to. Actually, I wasn't really so much worried about the highlights being blown out. I was worried about the highlights being grey.
Too muddy.
Yeah. And then the first question that came in was, well, what was the exposure range between what you did and the highlights? And I goes, I don't know. And that was obviously a key point that I'd missed.
So that's why you've got your spot meter.
Well, yeah, exactly. I can do it for more than one spot. I didn't realise that. I didn't realise I could pluralise it.
Well, the spot meter I use, I can sort of anchor that deepest shadow area, and then I can, by pressing a button called A or something, I can wave it around and see, and it'll say +2, +3, +4.
Yeah.
And without really worrying what they are, I can immediately in my head, if that says +4, +5 from my zone 3 upwards, then in my head I know how I'm going to develop that, you know.
Yeah.
Or I could perhaps not worry about it and use Pyro Developer, but maybe we'll come on to that. So you can wave it. The spot meters are great for that. That's to be honest, that's how I use mine the most, to just evaluate the range of tones in the scene, and it allows you to do that very accurately.
Yeah. But all this is good, isn't it? Because I think even if you feel like it's a kind of failure for now, you're learning, and this is what the zone system encourages. It encourages this kind of inquiry about where things are and in the scene and how it's going to come out in the print. And I think that's really great.
So so what this leads on to, forget the highlights for the moment. Let's just carry on with your analysing your picture, Simon, in the shadow areas. So you said you reduced the exposure by 2 stops to place it onto what you imagine zone 3 would be. So by definition, remember, zone 3 still has a hint of some working detail, some acceptable level of detail. Not too much, not too little, but John Blakemore would call it living blacks. And so when you developed your film, forget the highlights, when you developed your film, was that area that you metered from completely featureless, or did it have some detail?
Well, that's where things went horribly wrong. Because I've got plenty of detail in there, and this is always that thing about being able to actually do things methodically and in a way that you know what you're doing. And I did it in D76, which I've never used D76, and we mixed it up on the night in the dark room. And of course, I've never actually mixed a developer before that's from out of a packet. I've used liquid developers, mainly Rodinol. And so you're already at 20 degrees or thereabouts, so it's very easy to get to 20 degrees. But I certainly learned at the time, it's not so easy to get from 55 degrees or whatever it is down to 20 degrees without any form of cooling. and after about an hour.
So your developer was quite hot, so it would have been. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, and then we come into the next potential error: is how do I read a thermometer? and I thought that we can't. It's just never ever in the world going to get down to 20 degrees. So Paul Bullock of our Facebook group had come along, and he showed me how to use the Massive Dev app properly, in that you can actually adjust the temperature of your developer in there, and then it will give you a correspondingly short time, because the idea behind, if your chemicals are warmer, then it will develop things more quickly, so therefore you need to do it in a reduced time. But he also said that this is not necessarily a hard and fast and completely trustworthy method. It's an approximation of what they think that you're probably going to need with this different temperature value. And so I did it for 22 degrees centigrade, which brought the developing time down to around about 8 minutes instead of 12 minutes. And I'm not sure if that was actually if it was closer to 24 or 23 degrees. So it was just going wrong on multiple levels.
Well, Simon, D76. So here we get into the thing. Developer will have relatively more effect on the highlights and the shadows. Now, Richard, I think I'm right. There will be, depending on the nature of the developer, there will be some movement in the. You can vary the detail by moving the sort of foot speed, if I want to use that term. By some developers are, inverted commas, speed increasing, but the old adage remained: if it ain't recorded on the film, you're not going to develop it into existence. So there's a number of issues here, I think, both Simon and Richard, and because how you were rating, we get onto this business of exposure index. So the bit that you're missing, the bit that Simon's missing here, is the first step of doing his film speed tests. Yes. So he is confident that what he's visualizing as that zone 3, he's got a print in his hand, is made at a certain film speed using a particular developer at a particular temperature with a particular agitation regime, if he's, hand processing it in trays, if it's 5/4, and he knows that's going to get that result. So in a way, Simon's on a bit of a hiding to nothing when he starts to say, which developer, what temperature, how long. Yeah. It's not going to come together after the fact like that. So I think I maybe piped up in that thread, Simon, that if when you look at this area, so if you're starting out and you think, well, okay, I'm metering that shadow and I want it to have some detail in, but I don't want it to have masses and I don't want it to be blank. And if you're getting blank film, then instead of rating your film speed at your exposure index, then moves away from box speed, and maybe if it was 100 ASA film you were using, then maybe it becomes 80 or normally 60 or it goes 64. Lower, doesn't it? Because we're all that sort of common wisdom that usually it is. Most people normally find that, and I think meters and things are geared towards positive positive materials, not slide, for instance, and so they meters tend to. Yeah, but in the circumstances that I had, then I would have. Let's just say that. All things being equal, and I hadn't made a complete holics of the developing, then the only pointer would be to say, instead of it was FP4, by the way, I would have had to have rated the FP4 at probably close to 250. Well, maybe with your meter, but it's quite possible. Because it depends on your meter how it reads. Yeah, with LC29, I'm using HP5 at 250 based on that. That illustration that's on my blog post. So, I mean, don't worry about what you end up rating your film. Limit the equipment you're using. So 1 camera, 1 meter. If you're finding that in either with your meter, if in order to get the results you want, your shadows where you want, you're having to rate it at 250. Well, rate it at 250.
Yeah.
And then you know.
Yeah.
You may well find if you then used a different system, it might be different.
And actually, we can answer a little bit of James's question here, because if he's doing that, if he's rating his film, say at 250, and he's sending it off to his lab, then he's got an idea about normal processing times. If they've just processed it and he's happy with the shadow detail, then he can kind of work with that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's about effectively pushing and pulling the film, then, isn't it? And telling the lab to do, I shot it at this. Do it. Could you process it at that?
Well,
is that right?
I wouldn't. To be honest, I just wouldn't worry about pushing and pulling in those terminologies, because people get themselves in the right old muddle and palaver about these terms. The fact is, how you've exposed that shadow with a film speed that you've decided has got to be 250. It's nothing to do with wanting to push it or pull it. It's just a fact that in order for you to get your shadows placed where you want them, you are rating your film using your equipment at 250. Now that, someone else using that in that same scene, I might be metering it, and I'm finding that I'm using FP4 at 125 at box speed, or maybe 80 to give me those shadows. But with your equipment and your regime, that may be where you're having to rate the film. What you tell the lab at that point is really based on your next step, which is metering the highlights.
Yeah.
And if you find that it's like 10 stops from that anchor position, then you just tell them, I want you to reduce the development by 30% or something. That's probably not a bad place to start. Do you see?
I do. I just want to make just a little point there about rating at 250 in the circumstances of what I've done. So that wouldn't have been just a simple matter. I mean, I'm just thinking about the people listening now that are as inexperienced as I am, that to have got the look that I was trying to achieve there, it wouldn't have just been a matter of metering it, or rather setting my meter to 250. I still would have gone through that process of working out when I thought zone 5 is, and then dropping it by two stops on that particular point to make sure.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. Because once so we're not just saying you use that with your camera and your meter. I would do this a few times before you decided this is exactly how you're going to use FP4. But it could well be that with that camera and that meter, from now until the future, with you're always going to rate FP4 at 250. And then you forget about that. But then, so that becomes your exposure index for your film, 250. Then you just forget about it. So you come to your scene, you point your meter at that shadow.
You set 250 on the meter.
With 250 on the meter, and you drop your exposure by the fact that you've already, in your head, someone's telling you that you've already underexposing. Well, you're not. You've determined your own speed for that film using your equipment. So the first step is always to test your exposure at different film speeds using some information that Richard's got, or do a Google search about basic zone system tests. There are lots of other things involving putting a black cap, putting your lens cap over, shooting, and then doing another test with your zone 5 image, but changing the shutter speed. And then do things when you develop the film, does zone 3 appear where, you're just getting a hint of texture? Are you getting no texture? And so there's quite a lot of guides out there online about film testing to determine your own exposure index.
Yeah.
So don't get hung up over this exposure index.
No, we almost want to be able to take under and overexposure out of the terminology, because that is really confusing.
It is, yeah.
And this also demonstrates so many people. I think we almost hear it almost every podcast we ever do, and it's a case of settle on your equipment and settle on your film as well, because then at least at the point where you're actually trying to learn your craft, then you can come up with repeatable results.
Do you know what? There'll be loads of people out there who use all sorts of different films, and they're just, they wouldn't even think about placing shadows and developing and they're more than happy.
They enjoy it.
If you move into, and that's perfectly fine. Let's not take the fun out of this.
Yeah.
But if you go to an exhibition and go and see one of them, a master printer, go and see Tim Rudman's pictures. Go and see if you can see an Ansel Adams picture, and go and see Bruce Barnbaum's and Slot Canyon pictures, and then Les McLean. Go and see. Hold a print in your hand, and there's this term about the print is kind of singing and glowing to you. Yeah. Now they haven't just achieved this glowing print through dancing from one film to the other and not giving a hoot about exposure and development. They've mastered some of these techniques. Now they've got darkroom experience as well, which is helping them. Tim Rudman uses a bit of what he calls liquid sunshine, which is a little very dilute photographic bleach. And you can do all those things. But fundamentally, Barry Thornton is another one, the late Barry Thornton. They're all talking about fine prints, and there is a difference between a print that I'd make 9 times out of 10, and suddenly I've got one, and the highlights are glowing, the shadows have got some depth to them, and the mid-tones are beautiful, there's lovely tonality, and then you're working towards this thing that these guys would call a fine print. Yeah. And then you do need to have some understanding about placing shadows and how developing works. But for lots of people who are out there, they're just having loads of fun with their cameras, and they're not too worried if they're scanning them to Instagram or whatever.
Yeah, it depends on your workflow, doesn't it? Actually,
it does.
Because film's really forgiving. There's exposure latitude in film, which is great. And actually, what a lot of people will be doing is exposing 35mm film, having it scanned, and then processing it on Lightroom or something. And you can get really, really nice results doing that. So So that actually leads us on to part 2 of James's question. James says, also somewhat related to the above, in these days of hybrid workflows, in brackets, film, negative, digital scan, I've heard that a thinner negative is more desirable for post-processing flexibility. Since the zone system was invented with an analog workflow in mind, do I need to adapt its parameters to a hybrid workflow? Some film does scan easier than other film. So it depends on your scanner. It depends on what you're doing to it in post-processing, how you're doing that.
If a negative is thoroughly well-developed, overdeveloped, maybe overdeveloped and overexposed, does your normal film scanner, like my Epson V500 that I'm staring at, would that struggle more? Yeah,
I think so. And I think you're more likely to get
into those
blocked up highlights. And because I've noticed that for me, in my own work, my darkroom made negatives are much denser, have become more dense, I think, really looking at them, as I've become better at it and more accurate with it. But there are certain types of film that seem to lend themselves to scanning really well. So Delta 100 is a good example in black and white. XP2 is good, but then that's a slightly odd case because it's color film, which you process C41 and you print black and white.
What is it about Delta 100, you think, Richard? That
I think I'm not sure what the exact answer to this is. I think I remember reading somewhere that with the more modern films, emulsions, they tend to scan better, but I don't know whether.
So the T-Maxi things and deltas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think
I'm not the world's expert on scanning. The old experts would tell you that you should produce a negative for and I think this would probably hold up for darkroom and scanning. If you want to avoid excessive grain, for example, and highlights that are blown out, you should produce the thinnest possible negative that would still print and give you that tonality we're talking about, from detailed shadows to highlights that are in control. So you can give your black and white film an extra stop because you think you ought to, and that's probably fine, to be honest.
Yeah.
But the fine printers would start from the fact that you're going to have to start with a negative that isn't so dense that you're going to have unwanted grain. If you want grain, then
it depends what you're after, doesn't it?
What you're after, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would be more inclined to experiment a little bit with different film types in this instance. And again, it depends if James is shooting roll film or sheet film, But yeah, I think I'd go down the film route first before worrying too much about the density of the negative.
Yeah,
I think we've specifically asked this question before. I asked it to Matt Marash, and I think it's something that it's probably worth just going back over again, because people don't listen to every podcast, and that terminology about thin and thick negatives and density and so on with these negatives. Could you give a description about what we're talking about with that phrase?
Yeah, so it actually comes back to what we were talking about in terms of you exposing that negative and thinking about the shadows. The thing that you don't want to do with film is not produce enough exposure so that there isn't actually anything registered on the film. So that it's that we're referring to as density. How much is the film exposed? Has the film reacted with the light enough for there to be discernible shapes on there that you can work with and you can print with? So if you underexpose a negative too much, there's not enough exposure to the film, then there's nothing to print. There's no tone there at all. And I think with digital, it's become the other way around, hasn't it? That if you overexpose a digital, your highlights become pure white, and then there's no tone information there at all. So the common wisdom is that you're reversing, your practice and going, not exposing to the right, as it were, but not overexposing if it's digital, and exposing more generously if it's film.
So just in another way of looking at it then, and I'm not talking about necessarily correct exposure now, but
something that works for you.
Yeah. But I'm just thinking now, a dense negative could be something that is that's effectively heading towards overexposure, and a thin negative is heading towards underexposure. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah. But again, there's always caveats, aren't there?
Well, that's it. And the next part of that is there's going to be like a gold. Would I be right in thinking there's like a Goldilocks zone in the middle where it could be heading towards one way or the other, and it still work. It will still work, but it might work better for one thing than another. Hence, scanning versus printing, but they're both correctly exposed or correctly developed negatives.
Yeah, and I think that this is something I was thinking about when you were describing your situation, and I think Ansel Adams has this phrase of a flexible negative, doesn't he? One that's exposed in such a way that you've got the tones to work with, and then you can make those decisions. Because actually the thing we didn't talk about in your example was, what control have you got in the darkroom with this negative? Because there's things you can do there. We were talking earlier about John Blakemore challenging people to print dark or light. And there's things that you can do after the fact, but you want your negative to have those shapes and tones built into it to work with in the first place.
So in simple terms, if when you're talking about creating a certain kind of density of the negative, depending on what your output is going to be for that negative, the point where you actually take the photograph, the initial exposure, has no real bearing on that. Would that be fair to say? And really, it's more about the development side will produce you out. If you can modify it to be towards the dense or the thin side. We're
actually back to that whole thing about your own film speed there, I think. Well, and your own practice and your own.
I'm just thinking about all things being equal now. It is in general terms.
You can have if you're evaluating a negative and you look at an area of shadow, which is so on a negative that would be the thinner area.
Yeah.
If you're looking for an area of shadow and you're getting no detail there at all, even though you think in your head that should be sort of mid-grey, then that's that's some underexposure, because exposure affects the shadows. If you've got a negative where you've got plenty of shadow detail, but they still look as thin as hell, then maybe you've got oxidized developer, or that would be under development.
Yeah.
So that's how you tell.
Yeah.
One to t'other. If you've made up, make up fresh chemicals with fresh developer.
Yeah, definitely.
Follow the menu. If you're starting out on this, don't take any risks about using something.
Don't use a 6-month-old open developer pot, because.
Okay, I'm going to back the question back in while we're still in this zone, you've got fresh developer and so on, and you're going to develop your negative, and it says that it's going to be for 8 minutes. And is there something you can do in that timing to decide whether you actually want that better for printing or better for scanning within that development time, or am I just completely off the mark?
The answer is next time, which again is back to what the zone system encourages you to do. So you in that example, you develop at 8 minutes, and then you see what happens. You scan it, you print with it. Is it really hard to get the highlights to come through if I'm printing in the darkroom? Have I got blown out highlights on the scanning? And then you adjust from there. That's the key thing. Yeah, you have to evaluate and then adjust.
If your highlights are constantly blown out with your 8 minutes, next time try 7 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can be more methodical in the testing, which is back to walls and towels and things.
I'm still not sure if that's really answering the question, though. As in, we're not talking about a correct exposure here. We're talking about this flexible negative principle and like a Goldilocks zone where it can be dense or less dense, but still be correctly exposed.
Well, you can't get away from the two. They're interlinked together.
Yeah.
They're interlinked together. The flexible negative would be, John Blakemore would say he wants to get on his negative a range of 4 to 5 stops. So if his scene in front of him is registering 7 stops between where he wants to see his living blacks. So John is looking primarily for these blacks where there's some detail still. So zone 3. So he's then metering the highlights, and as long as it's 4 to 5 stops, he knows that he can develop in his ID11 1+1 for 8 minutes. I know this because he told me. And that gives him a negative which has shadow detail and highlight detail.
Yeah.
So the negative has captured those extremes of tonality where he wants them. And that is by definition, his flexible negative. So if he then wants to print a negative with no shadow detail in it at all, he can. If he wants to print it with bags of shadow detail, he can, because it's got shadow detail. If he wants to print it so the highlights become specular, he can do that.
Yeah.
If he wants to print it so the highlights are glowing, he can do that because the highlights are contained within his negative. So that's what he means. If you've got a negative which is where your shadows are just blank, you'll never be able to produce a living black because the shadows have no detail at all.
And there's also examples of people like Adams going back and reprinting earlier negatives, but with a slightly different approach. Slightly more contrasty image or darkening certain parts differently.
The press photographers. Now, I was looking for the quote, and I can't find it in that book that I recommended to you, the Amateur Photographer's Handbook by Aaron Sussman, and this has got all sorts of good stuff in it. But he talks about something that I'd read about before, about looking at a negative and holding it over newspaper print. Richard, you might remember this. If you can read, then you should still be able to read your negative, your newspaper. Your newspaper.
Yeah.
You should still be able to read your text through the densest part of the negative.
Right.
That then gives you. That's what the newspaper print people would have done if they're evaluating negatives. They would have stuck it over some newspaper. If anyone buys newspapers now, and if you can still read your text through there, not as clear as day, but if you can just see it and read it, then your negative is probably not far off development-wise.
Yeah. See, I think this is where we come back to I always think about being able to kind of close the loop in a way. So if I'm making decisions about a process, am I going to be able to see that all the way through? So in the darkroom example, it's being able to expose film and print it myself. So that, I think people get sort of hung up on the density of a negative, or the answer is actually in your own work and your own printing. How are you finding that to print and to work with? Are you able to get a range of tones, that you want at a certain grade when you're printing?
Your enlarger is going to be different from mine.
Absolutely. So I've got an institutional darkroom where each enlarger is different, and students will come to me and say, "But I printed for this time last week, and it's different today. What's going on?"
And
you're on a different enlarger.
Yes, so I mean, it could be that you've got a black and white, what would be marketed as a black and white enlarger, and that could well have a light bulb in it in old money, which probably may or may not have a opaque covering around it, and that could be projecting through a set of condenser lenses.
Yeah.
So that would be a condenser enlarger, and by definition, they are you'll get a more contrasty print. That's a sort of contrastier system. If you're using a color head where the illumination is different, mine's got some tungsten lamps in it, and it fires through a light box to soften and diffuse the lighting before it goes down through the negative. So you get a softer. It's condenser enlargers. Negative blemishes show up more. That's a different thing. Yeah. But so I know now. With the prints I make, with the negatives I develop it from my way of working, I know that I can get a nicely toned, a nicely balanced print on my De Vere enlarger when I set it to grade 3.
Yeah.
Right. And so I know that.
That's your kit. It's your work.
But someone else on a if I took that negative and used a black and white enlarger, I'd probably, in order to get the same tonality in my print, maybe I'm down to zone grade 2, for example. If I find that I'm forever having to set grade 5 in there, then that's telling me there's probably something gone astray with that particular. But with that particular negative, it's either very, very thin. Maybe I've underexposed it or something. So I'm in the realms of trying to rescue it. So I know that once I'm start using grades that are outside my norm to get a pleasing print, I'm probably working with a negative that I've cocked up somehow.
Yeah, and your paper also is having an effect, because different papers will have different curves.
Yeah, I don't mess around with too many different papers, really. Well, I've started to a little bit for lith printing and stuff, but that's another story.
Yeah. But the same principle applies. So you've got all of these different elements. You've got your camera, its shutter. You've got your light meter. You've got how you're processing the film. You've got your own enlarger with its bulb and is it condenser, diffuser, and all the rest, and your paper.
Cold cathode, whatever that is.
Yeah.
But that's another one, isn't it?
Yeah. And temperature of your developer and how you've diluted your developer. But it's brilliant in a way as well. It's, it's this wonderful craft where there's these tiny, it's a human thing, because we're making all of these slight changes in our own work, and there's a fingerprint of us in our work because of all of this. I'm going
to just move on to the third part of James Thorpe's question.
Yeah. I was going to say, Andrew, I think before we move on to that one, I think let's just there's a question about what I was doing last week, which I think probably carries on from where we've just been talking.
Yeah, we didn't really get to the end of that,
and that was the scene that I took. I subsequently learned that was probably about 3 stops between the point I measured and the brightest highlight. So my main concern was having grey highlights. That was what I was, because I was bringing the exposure down to make certain areas black, which would therefore mean I would also my highlights wouldn't be as bright. what would be the advice in that kind of situation? So say we're looking at 3 to 4 stops difference between an area I want to have black, but I want the water area and this long exposure to be perfectly exposed. So that's almost to the point of blowing out, but there's still detail there, and I want my blacks to be black. So I want a really contrasty scene. What would be the process there in the darkroom, assuming I'd actually measured it correctly at the time?
So you would have, if you'd followed the zone system and you'd metered your highlights and found that there was only a 3 or 4 stop difference in that scene, you'd still be going from your exposure from the shadows, but you would be extending your development to move the highlights from, zone 6 or wherever they were, 5 or 6 to 7 or 8.
That's
and then
it.
you would have that negative to take into the darkroom, which is the negative that Andrew's been describing, with all the tones available to you, to hopefully print in a mid-grade, to then have that flexibility to change as you desire once you're in there.
That's it. And the eureka moment's just come to me, because that's that business about the N+2 or something like that, isn't it?
Exactly. It actually follows the zones.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you only know through some testing, even if it's rudimentary testing, like I'm following the big dev chart at my 8 minutes, but I'm finding that for most of my shots, there's no detail in the highlights. Well, that's suggesting that's probably not N development for your system. That could well be N+1 or even N+2. So make a note. Actually, 8 minutes is going to give me a really hot negative with blown out highlights. So I'm going to take off. What's a good rule of thumb, Richard? 15%? I don't know.
Yeah, that's the one that's always quoted, isn't it? 15 or 20%. And
so
work
take
on
off,
that.
Take off 15%, and that drops your highlights down a zone.
Yeah.
No,
and that could end up being that could end up being your N development, or it might be N+1.
But again, remember, it's specific to you. Somebody else might be saying, "Oh, that's fine for me. That works. I get these negatives." But don't forget about that. Yeah.
But extending the process, that will make my it solves the highlight problem that I have. So I make sure that those highlights are exactly the point I want them to be. I take it. Well, aren't we running the risk of? And I think you did allude to this earlier, Andrew. That I guess if I'd actually placed something to the point where I wanted it to be black, it should still be black, and no matter extra development will actually bring back something that isn't there. So in theory, that those black areas won't start to grey up just because I'm extending the development for the highlights. Is that fair? Or
theoretically, yeah, they shouldn't move really.
There will be a little bit of movement, I think, but not so much that you would worry about it. And
the other part of that, because we've got solvent developers and we've got compensating developers, if I've got my terminology correct there, and Caffeinol was the way that I wanted to do this, which is a compensating developer, which is I basically ran out to take waterfalls because of Wayne Setzer.
Well, Wayne, I don't know. So Wayne, I don't know if you listened to.
I didn't listen to that, no.
He uses Caffeinol CL developer with some bromide in it because he's using it as stand development.
Right.
We got onto a full discussion about the benefits of using stand development. Not people. Some people just use it because it's like a magic system, apparently. But really, it's designed to control those highlights. And Wayne's making some beautiful fiber prints. And he's using Caffeinol with his FP4, and he's using it to give him highlights that are controlled. Matt Marash uses and other large format photographers use some form of pyro because that has that same compensating effect. Maybe Richard, you could.
I haven't used them. I haven't done stand development.
But the theory of compensating developers.
Yeah, so that is, as you say, it's about controlling the highlights, isn't it? So if you have exposed generously, then a compensating developer should limit the density of those highlights.
Yeah, when I'm using Tmax 400, which I've just started to, and I'm developing it in a compensating developer, in my case PMK Pyro, which is a commercially available version, Burger or Berger make it, for instance. You can buy that, and I'd thoroughly recommend it. I've done a lot of research online, and I've decided that 200 to 250 is where I should be starting to base my exposures. Now I need to then see if that's working for me, and it is, because I'm getting some nice shadow detail. So I'm happy with my system 200 to 250, and then using either a very dilute cathinol or, in my case, the Pyro. It's not allowing those highlights to overdevelop. Now, the Pyro does it in a different way to stand development. Stand development works by
being more diluted, doesn't it?
Being very diluted. So the area that's achieved the most exposure gets expired. The developer runs out of steam quite quickly because you're not agitating.
Yeah.
So it's not seeing fresh developer. Whereas the areas that have had less exposure, that's right, isn't it? Have I got that around the right way? They continue to develop, because there's, they've got it takes longer for the active elements to develop to be used up. So there's a natural contrast control. Now, I can't quite remember how Pyro does it, but it has the same sort of, someone will tell us on the Facebook group.
Yeah.
Pyro does act through because it's a staining developer and does stuff to the clumps of film grain, but it effectively helps you control the and
interestingly, we're kind of going into the same place as with the zone system, but it's just different. It's a different approach, isn't it? It's a different recipe and a different flavor.
I think I think you might have to tweak your times a bit with Pyro now and again, but generally the advantage of using those sort of systems is that you end up on quite often a broadly similar time for different films. But I have got different times for my PMK. I'm doing times between 11 and 13 minutes. I think, but for stand development in general, I think they just generally recommend one time.
Yeah. No, I mean, for me, I experimented a little bit with Rodinol, but a long time ago, so I don't use it now.
Mm-hmm. So, Simon, can I move on to part 3 of this question? Or
yes, you may.
So James says, and finally, take an average street scene at night. So you know what I'm going to be recommending Andrew Sanderson's nighttime photography book again now. Finally, take an average scene at night, a couple of street lamps, maybe an illuminated shop window or two, murky pavement. When I meter that scene with a light meter, it tries to make everything 18% grey, making the scene much too bright. Well, it depends where you're pointing your light meter, James, really.
I wonder whether he's not using a spot meter. Well, it sounds like he's using
just pointing it at the scene.
Yeah.
And you can, depending whether you point it slightly up at those street lights or slightly down at the murk, is going to affect.
Is it matrix metering? Is it center weighted? Is it spot meter? It all makes a difference, doesn't it?
So how would you, if you're out at night time, Richard, I don't know if you do any night time.
I don't actually. No, I don't at all.
Well, the same thing would apply though, wouldn't it?
It would, absolutely. Absolutely. We could apply the same principles of looking at those areas that we want to be dark, but with tones and, good highlights, maybe even specular highlights for the bits that are really bright. So we can apply exactly the same principles. I think if you're shooting roll film, I think there's quite a few people out there who've written about their own experiences, with nighttime photography and sort of good rules of thumb. I'm thinking of
Ian Barnaby Nutt was one.
Sandeep as well. Give Me a Biscuit.
Yep.
on Twitter.
Yeah. Sandeep, Give Me a Biscuit, and
Yeah.
Ian Barnaby Nutt are two. Well, I think Ian's made a couple of blog posts about his nighttime photography, hasn't he? And maybe produced a little magazine as well.
Yeah, and they've got some really good advice on, rules of thumb for doing it, but I don't tend to do any nighttime photography.
Maybe where you live, you might get mugged. That's why Simon doesn't go out.
Yeah, that's quite possible, actually. It is.
Yeah, well, I've done quite. I'm not going to be able to help answer this question, but I've done quite a bit of nighttime photography digitally. And that's also with a mirrorless camera. So you don't really learn that much when you're using a mirrorless camera, and sometimes because you're looking at the screen, you can see what the exposure is going to be. And I say look at the screen, you're looking through an electronic viewfinder, and you then think, oh, that's a bit too dark, so I'll just compensate in one direction until it's right. So, but that's not really teaching you anything, is it, really?
But I don't know. I mean, in terms of learning, and I'd even go as far as saying, do that when you're learning film. Take a DSLR out with you and make some exposures and look at the exposures on the back and think about if that can help you join the dots. Then,
Yeah, the other thing there, of course, is how different films deal with low light. Assuming we're still within, not having to worry about reciprocation when we go over.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
but I do wonder if some films just would behave differently to a digital camera.
They will for sure. Yeah, they will.
Yeah. So I certainly wouldn't want to rely on a digicamera. But the other side of it is I've used 35mm cameras with decent meters, such as back in the day I would do night scenes with a Contax camera, and I used to just point it at the scene in aperture priority and press the button, and I'd get a scene that was
and
about
the metering
right.
would know what to do. Yeah,
and the same. I did something a couple of years ago with an Olympus OM4 Ti with a night scene, and it was. I think it's exposed for about. I think it was about 2 minutes. I was in a certain amount of shock. I was beginning to think, like, is this camera faulty?
Yeah.
Surely they can't keep on going for that length of time. But he did. Whatever, I don't know what the maximum is, but it worked out exactly right. And that time was somewhere at least a minute longer than the same scene with a similar type of lens and a similar aperture on a digital camera. So definitely it's not the case you can just hit one and do the other in those difficult lighting scenarios.
But you can apply that principle of repetition, can't you? So you can have a go once and then see where that gets you, whether you like it or not, and then go again and adjust from that point,
And that's where it comes down to making notes, of course, then, isn't it?
Yeah, so not being afraid to try, Because I think, a lot of this stuff, it's, I was thinking this a little bit when I was listening to Ben Horn talk about large format cameras, and there's a lot of photography technical stuff, isn't it, that can put people off, where you're thinking...
Yeah, we've just been talking about it for the last hour.
Yeah. Okay, there's that podcast with Richard Pickup, yeah. But you get the point, don't you, that, just give it a go.
I think
so all that stuff is there, and I love all this detail,
it's brilliant.
And I love reading about it. But but don't let it stop you going out and making pictures.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let it help inform the way, if it gives you a bit of extra control to free your artistic vision, then that's probably what it's best used for.
Yeah.
Don't be paralyzed into
and I think people are asking the questions for the right reasons, aren't they? Because they want that control. But I think there's a tendency sometimes for those things to become theoretical and then not be, you give it up because you're thinking, well, I just don't know the answer to that, so I won't even try.
Richard, your photography, I think predominantly, certainly in the past, has been a lot of street photography. Yeah. Small format cameras.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Is medium format a relatively new venture for you? Sorry, large format.
Large format is, yeah. I was looking this morning before coming to the podcast about a few dates of things to see if I could get in my mind. And I think I started to write about large format sort of early 2017.
Yeah, I saw your blog post. That's when you went to China?
2.5 years. Yeah.
China trip?
To Shanghai. Yeah. So yeah, I'm new to large format. And I'm learning all the time, I guess, like, you know, a lot of us are working through it and trying it out. And
well, the only real difference is, you know, having a camera which is, you can shift that plane of focus as we talked about, or as Wayne Setzer talked about quite eloquently a couple of shows back, and having to just deal with a bigger negative, really. But
yeah, and I suppose the thing for me, the contrast with the street photography is obviously the whole MO with street photography is that you're out there, you're walking, you know, things are coming to you, everything is very quick. But with large format, it's much more deliberate. You're thinking about a location, you maybe even location scouting before you go there.
How did you find yourself using your Intrepid? So as a street photographer, if I can call you that, someone who loves that genre, you've suddenly got this Intrepid, you've gone to Shanghai, which really is crying out for small, lightweight, handheld cameras, you know, fan ho, deep shadows, bright sunshine.
Yeah.
How did you end up using your large format Intrepid camera?
That's a really good question. I think I was doing the 35mm stuff anyway, so carrying on with that as normal. And then I think, I did feel a little bit like I was trying to use the large format in a fairly street photography way. And then obviously there's a kind of tension to that.
And people kept tripping over your tripod.
Well, or at least I had to keep finding places to sort of, I mean, I think in street photography, if you've done a lot of it, you're very aware of where your body is, and it's there's a lot of movement to it, I think. And I try to use that kind of, I don't know, street craft or whatever, you know, to give it a grand term, to kind of be able to set up the 5.4 where I wouldn't get in the way, but I could still make interesting shots, although I kind of did get in the way a couple of times.
Did you end up focusing on life going past you? Were you looking for that sort of, did you set up in an interesting scene and waited for folks to come past in an interesting way? Did you do any formal street portraits saying, come and stand in front of me?
Yeah, I don't think I quite had the time for it to be that considered in some ways. I think I'd had mornings or afternoons where I just thought, right, I'm taking the 5.4 out now. Yeah. Let's see what happens. Yeah. I mean, there's an image that I made of a kind of derelict building and a view, and there's a kind of modern part of Shanghai behind, which contrasts with this derelict building. But there was a guy in the image, so it's a kind of a street shot. And I hadn't intended him to be in it necessarily, because he was as I was setting up the 5.4, he was around and about the scene, and I just concentrated on the building. But then I suppose the street photography me kicked in and thought, well, he's doing interesting things. If I can place him in the frame somewhere that I like, then, you know, I'll go with that.
And since then, though, I've seen your work featured in the Intrepid's own little publication. And yours was the one with the two surfers stood there?
No, that's not me.
That's not you. Else. I keep thinking that was you. Which one was yours?
There's an alleyway one. There's the one in the building, and there's one of by the riverside.
Okay.
Some posts. But it was interesting to see how, because I guess you're really conscious when you're a stranger in a strange place. You're really conscious of how people are going to react to you.
Yeah.
And it was kind of interesting to see, like the alleyway one, I'd set up in this alleyway and it just started to rain. So I was a bit conscious of the rain. But I was kind of on the cusp of, should I be here or not? Because it's kind of the back of somebody's houses. And as I was setting up, this guy came out, and I thought, he came out of a sort of back door, and I thought, oh.
Did he have a meat cleaver with him?
Well, I was kind of thinking something like that. He's going to approach me. He's going to say, you know, what on earth are you doing here? And it was just surreal, because he walked quite close to me, and then he just walked off as if I wasn't there. And I was like, well, is this the kind of thing in China? Am I just invisible. It's kind of, you know.
Maybe you'd ventured into an alternate reality.
Maybe, yeah. But I think that just on the whole, I think there was a lot of respect for. I mean, somebody else in a different. I think in the car park where that derelict building was, there was a guy who drove into the frame as I was taking that shot, and then he saw me and he kind of moved his car because he knew that he was in the frame. So there's a lot of respect for kind of cameras and photographers. Yeah.
So, what's your latest use for the large format? Are you finding yourself now moving towards subjects and ideas that are more suited to that medium?
Yeah, I think I'm at a little bit of a hiatus point with it, because my difficulty is my advantage of being here, my place of work full time, being able to drip in with the development. My disadvantage is that I can't get out, so I can't go places. And that really struck me, obviously, listening to Ben Horn's podcast, because he, has that whole thing, doesn't he, where he ventures out and into the wilderness.
Yeah, he goes off. I think I'm just watching him at the moment. He's gone to a new place in his latest series of videos he's in.
Yeah.
He said I think he said 14-hour drive or something.
Wow.
Ridiculous.
Wow. So I think there's a bit of me that's really envious of that. But then on the other hand, you make work in your own conditions, don't you? And your own environment. So I've started to do a few more portraits with a 10x8, which I've really enjoyed.
Oh, you've moved on to even larger formats.
I kind of, yeah.
Is that the Intrepid?
That's the Intrepid again, yeah.
Is that the latest one, the Mark II?
Yeah, I had the original one.
Okay.
So I wrote a review of the original one. And yeah, I did a portrait of my dad the other week, and yeah, I'm really enjoying that, because there's obviously a certain character there's a certain grandioseness to a 10x8 portrait, Are
you finding the move up from 5x4 to 10x8? Are you finding what are the main differences you're finding, apart from the sheer size of the camera? But is your workflow changing in any other way? The look of...
I think what appealed to me about 10x8 was contact printing.
Oh yeah.
So I've spent a lot of time working with coming up with a system where I could print with a white border.
Right.
Which is actually, it sounds like a very simple thing, but it turned out to be quite a laborious thing to get right, because I'm using
what size paper are you?
So I'm using sort of, I don't know, 9 by 14, no, a bit bigger than that, 11 by 14, something like that. Mm-hmm. So printing the 10x8 negative in the middle, but using a mask printed on an inkjet machine.
Right.
So I spent quite a lot of time getting the mask right.
Yeah, so you're getting the mask is very thin, isn't it then? So you're not...
So it's kind of like, I suppose it's about roughly 2 inches, an inch and a half wide all the way around the paper.
So a black acetate frame.
That's it, yeah. So I ended up using a picture frame. Yeah. So a picture frame that's been taken apart with the acetate mask against the glass, and then the negative on top of that, and then the paper on top, and then the frame's reassembled. And so yeah, that's been kind of technically challenging, but good fun to do, because it now means that I've got prints with this,
And are you using the enlarger as a light source?
Yeah.
And are you using...
so it's multigrade, and it's...
And you're using different contrast? You can still...
it's a multigrade enlarger, so yeah, you can change it just the same.
So you can change the colour of the light accordingly?
Yep.
So,
So
are you doing any other normal darkroom procedures, dodging and burning?
So I've been doing all that. I think there's been a bit of a learning curve, because you can't see the image so well.
Yes.
It's quite dark.
That's right, yeah.
So you have to get used to seeing. I mean, I can understand, because Ansel Adams built an enlarger, didn't he? Still, even when he was printing 10x8, he projected his images.
Yeah.
So he could physically intervene. He could see the image projected, and he could physically intervene with his dodging and burning. But no, I've been doing it the kind of the cheap way, and but that's okay because I've been learning stuff by doing that.
Yeah, I've done a bit of contact printing, and that's what I thought. I can still dodge and burn, but I said I can't see what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's like
I'm going to have to guess where my hands are.
Yeah, I think
where my hands are, where the shadow is.
I remember at a certain stage in my printing, just reading somebody say, "Just rehearse it," and that helped an awful lot. And actually, without the paper in, and if you just look at it and see where things are on the negative. So, I mean, on the picture I did of my dad, there's kind of he's wearing this hoodie, which I really wish I'd asked him to take off, because he's got a hoodie and he's got a shirt on underneath, but he's got these two great big white cords on his hoodie, which I had to burn in. And so I ended up having to make quite specific little masks that fit the shape of it. So it could be like an inch off the paper. And
when I've had really tiny bits in a print that are just bugging me like that, do you know what I've done in the past? I've got a very soft pencil. I've just applied the graphite to that, and then with my finger, I've just rubbed it in gently. Do you know what? It works really well.
Nobody notices.
No, absolutely.
That's brilliant. Yeah. But that's all part of the fun of it for me.
I can't spend any money at the moment, but I've often thought, and when I picked up the 8x10 Intrepid at the photography show, I went on, and in fact, if you go onto the Large Format Photography Podcast Facebook group banner page, you'll see me and Simon and Max from Intrepid in deep conversation. Well, I'm talking and Max and Simon are just looking confused. But that was the small camera. But the 810, I thought, wow. And I was thinking, I got to justify why I'd want that, when I'm quite happy with the smaller large format. And I think, like you, so I'm doing some 8x10 work now, but in pinhole camera, and I'm contact printing, and I'm enjoying that contact print process. Yeah. And I thought, well, maybe that's how I would use, like you. That's how, unless you've got an 8x10 enlarger, then you're gonna. That's what you're gonna do, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Steve Shakespeare, who's been on this show, he has one of those big enlargers, so it takes up virtually the whole of his house.
Yeah, they are huge, aren't they?
Yeah, but for me, it was just, it's going to add another layer of confusion to my workflow. Do I take this camera? Do I that camera? At the moment, if I'm shooting large format, I've got very few decisions to make. If I had the bigger one, I'd have
other ones.
When would I use this camera? When would I use the other? And I would be paralyzed by indecision.
Yeah. See, I think in some ways I've used the two together. So I've used the 5.4 to do a lot of the sort of testing and the kind of more mobile stuff, and then I'm using a 10x8 when I know that I can, I've got that opportunity to take my time and set it up and be in the right place. So they do kind of work together. Okay.
Can we ask you about? I'll get M from Emulsive will shoot me if we don't ask this. You did this study. It might have even been an Emulsive blog post. I don't know, or maybe he shared it. On, let's just call it Pebbles.
Oh yes, the Pebble project.
So do you want to tell folks about the Pebble project and what you've learned from it, and what we can take from it?
So it came about. The shot itself was stolen from a friend of mine, a guy called Jevon Tooth. And what Jevon had done, he was doing some kind of testing, but he'd used pebbles, and I was really impressed by just how he had this idea. He wanted a range of tones, so he'd use these stones, and these stones gave him this range of tones. And it came about because there was a point in one year where I'd sat down and I'd started to ask myself what film and developer combinations had I used so far, and which were my favorites, because I think I'd probably been, like a lot of people, I'd used lots of different films and lots of different developers, and I was thinking, can I not now sort of identify something that's a bit more my preference, but I've got all of these choices. So I actually started to map it out, and then I thought, I've got these prints, and I know I like, I don't know, Ilfasol S and Delta 100, and I know I like it in that print, but then I had a different print that I liked in a different film and developer combination, with a different subject matter, different light. And so I kind of thought, well, I can compare, but I can't compare like for like. Mm-hmm. So I started to think about using the pebbles as a way of just setting up some shots that would be the same ostensively, but with these different film and developer combinations, which turned out to be a heck of a lot of work, as you'd imagine. So shooting, a few frames on one roll, and then, or shooting a roll rather of a scene set up with specific lighting with the pebbles, and then chopping that film, doing one in one developer, one in another developer, or changing the development time and seeing how that came out.
So in the dark, you were, say, exposing a roll of 35mm film. Was it 35mm?
It was 30. It was all 35.
Yeah, that would make sense. And then you were just, because it's the same scene, you were just randomly cutting a section of that and developing it in something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So I'd have these rolls at different stages and different,
Wow.
So
and did it make life easy for you, or did it just make life even more complicated?
Yeah, I think I obviously got fed up of it at a point and stopped doing it, and moved back to actually taking pictures of stuff.
Yeah.
So there's obviously that aspect to it, but I think actually as a learning exercise and as a teaching tool, it's really good, and I still use it. So when I'm faced with a group of students and I'm talking to them about developer, and then I say, and of course you can change developer for a different look, and they all just are kind of going, he's got this plastic bottle in front of him that he's waving at us, and we've got no idea what he's talking about. Yeah. I can now bring up those pebbles and say, look, this is this film in this developer, and look, you can see more grain, or there's a different, at least so that they know roughly what I'm talking about.
And where can people find this Pebble project?
So it's on my website under resources. There's a set of menus at the top, and if you click on resources, there's a drop down, and you can get to it that way. But I did do a series of blog posts about it as well, where I was trying to describe the differences between the films and developer. But I think I was explaining earlier to Andrew that that became tricky to do that.
I was just going to say, I've been on your page for a while, just looking at the different results there.
Yeah.
If I may, I don't know if it's within your ability on the website or not, but it would be great if you could just click from one straight into another. Because as things are, you look at one and then you think, I'll look at something else, and you've got to come out. Yeah.
It's not like Lightroom or something, is it, where you can do a sort of comparing?
Or at least one just goes going morphing into the next. It just you sort of forget what the first one was like. By the time
it is hard. That is, it is. Yeah, but I think in terms of, say, coming back to the earlier discussion, if somebody says something abstract like, I like the look of the tones in my images with Perceptol, then actually you can go and see HP5 in Perceptol and see actually there is, those shadow tones are lighter given those manufacturers' developer time. So there's another link to our earlier complicated discussion. Yeah.
So I'm just looking at different ones now. I'm just looking at the difference between they're all EP4, and you've got DDX 1+4, 10 minutes and 20 degrees, and then there's another one with Rodinal 1 to 50 there, and it's really interesting just to see the difference, and they're very well. It's all subtle, but it's clear as well at the same.
There are differences, yeah.
I think this is when I've made prints from different film stocks and different developers. I've been broadly, I'm happy with that, and you don't really notice the difference in certainly in printing until you then look at it printed either a different way, because there are so many variables, so many ways you can be happy, because it's about what makes you happy, really. So you can produce a print and it has a certain look, and you can be really happy with it, and that could be because of the film you use, developer you use, and you can then go and use a different combination, and the end result it speaks to you in much the same way. So, it's all good, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Really,
it is.
Really ineloquent, but I know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I think that it's about it shows you the choice that's there.
Yeah,
and there's a depth to this, isn't there? That if you want to investigate those things, if you're inclined as I was at that point, and you want to take that journey, then it's there, and that medium will reward you with that information. But likewise, if you don't have the time for that, or you're not interested, and you're more interested how a person looks on film, and you just want to get to that result, then you go for that.
Yeah. Your website is, I have to say, congratulations on being such a generous person. Really, I think it's probably because of your teaching background, and I just know from interacting with you online how how encouraging you are and how you share information. And your website's got a lot of stuff on there. You use this in line with your teaching. You point your students to
because I think that was, if I can sort of vaguely remember, the reason for starting the website was, obviously it's to do with my own work and getting that out there, but it's sharing that engagement with photography, and that I suppose that passion that I've got for it, that I share with students, and it sits very well alongside my teaching. I teach level 3 students, so these are kind of A-level level students. So there often isn't a huge amount of time where you can go into a lot of technical detail, because it's more orientated around the basics of of exposure, and for the technical aspects you only go so far. But I think to have a resource that's digital, to say to a student, well, if you want to find out more about that, have a look at that blog post, or I did something on that, or you can look more about that camera. It's a really brilliant thing to have that, to be able to point in that direction.
Yeah, and you've written a lot for emulsive.org, haven't you?
Yeah, I think in some ways he really helped me, because early on I'd started Twitter. I think I was encouraged by one of the directors that worked at college, who was very connected in his digital work. And I sort of followed him a little bit to start the social media. But M was somebody that I met online quite quickly, and he sort of said, well, would you like to write something for Emulsive? Which I did, which is about visualization. Yeah. And he was very good at promoting that.
He is good at that.
And he does that for people, doesn't he? Yeah. He kind of takes them under his wing a little bit and puts them out there. Again, you mentioned generosity. He's very generous about giving people that limelight, and that really helps, I think.
He is good. Yeah.
Yeah.
If he wasn't all over the internet, we'd have him on this show, but I think
he gets too much time.
He gets enough publicity,
too much exposure
without us talking to him.
Yeah. He's also just banned me from one of his Facebook groups as well.
Oh, has
he? He has, yeah. So
is that this? Oh, Facebook group.
Yeah, he's got one. The hypersensitive. Because he's got his own podcast. It's the Hypersensitive Photographers podcast, which is an interesting podcast.
Why has he banned you from it? What did
you do?
Well, they had this theme with the podcast. The last one they did was they just put a new one out, and they taught. He gave a recipe in this photography podcast about how to make crumpets.
Yeah,
and
I haven't listened to that. I heard about it and I thought I just can't be bothered to listen to it.
Well, to be honest, I thought it was the best thing on the whole podcast. I thought it was brilliant, and it then led to because I suppose there's a small group that's attached to that podcast, and the group pretty much ran with it. This theme about baked goods. And so the whole of the month, there was nothing to do with photography, or maybe there might have been a photo study of eating crumpets and stuff like that, and other baked goods. And I think Em and Hamish decided, we've had enough of this. We're not going to do it anymore, and so on. So, and he quite clearly said, if anybody puts a picture up there of some kind of baked good,
you're banned.
Then you're going to get banned. And I just happened to have this picture that I took several years ago with a mobile phone of some fruit loaf in my toaster, and at the top of this round of fruit loaf, it looked like there was because the way the currents had been organised, it looked like I had Che Guevara.
I thought you had Jesus in your.
No, it's similar, but not quite Jesus. No, it was Che Guevara, definitely Che. And I just innocently posted the picture of Che Guevara in toast, and he banned me for it. So
it's a bit harsh, isn't it?
There you go. He's telling me actually he didn't ban me. He just kicked me from the group, and I can go back anytime I like. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm banned. So
I'd take it as a personal affront. If you want me back, you have to
bring me back in.
Get down on your hands and knees and beg.
Exactly.
Being banned is more impressive than
it is
temporarily suspended or something.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, my co-host, one of my co-hosts in the other podcast I do, the Classic Lenses podcast, also got kicked out of the group for doing, I assume, something similar. And his response was to create a different group using pretty much the same logo, and then it scrolled over it saying "The Real Hypersensitive," and also adding to it, the welcoming banned exiles from the other group and so on.
Like the real IRA, isn't
it? Exactly. And M joined that group, and
he infiltrated it.
He did, and he made a comment on it, and I just instantly muted him for 12 hours for having the nerve to even speak on it. So I'm trying to get my own back there.
Oh no!
So finally, visualization for film photographers. Let's end on a short topic. We touched on visualization, didn't we, when we were in the depths of our discussion about Simon, trying to encourage Simon to think how he wanted this picture to look. So what are some of the things? I mean, we could just point people to your article, Visualization for Film Photographers. But in a nutshell, as we've got you here, what are some of the what is visualization, and why should we give a hoot?
So visualization is seeing in your mind's eye how the print, perhaps, or the image on screen is going to come out after you have taken that shot. So it's about being able to visualize the end point to a process when you're, taking the shot or thinking about the shot. So it, like the zone system idea, it is about what's part of the zone system idea. It's about practicing enough so that you've gone through that process, you've taken shots, you've printed those shots, and you're making adjustments, and you're confident that what you're seeing, and it's not just about exposure. There's other elements as well, framing the shot, your aperture choice, your use of shutter speed, how all of those things will affect your image and the way it comes out.
Yeah, there's been it's a really interesting area, and I suppose the more I read about photography from people like Stephen Shaw did one on the ways of seeing. I think it's called something like that. The former director of the New York gallery, John Sarkowski, he's done one on how you read photographs. Again, I forget the title. I'll dig these books out and put them in the show notes. But he talks about, essentially aids to visualization. So think how the constraints of compressing a 3D picture into a 2D image, and how, and the consciousness of framing, how you introducing something. Stephen Shaw, in one of his YouTube lectures, talks about a picture he took where there's a stop sign and there's a cloud above it, and he said in reality the cloud wasn't on top of the stop sign, but by his viewpoint and by compressing the image into 2 dimensions, he's got a cloud sitting on top of a on top of a stop sign.
Yeah.
And that could be to do with perspective. It could be to do with focal length, the lens you're choosing to use, your viewpoint, and it's all tied up. People talk about being able to see in black and white as well, don't they? And and visualize how tones are affected and the use of filters and different types of film. So all of this adds up, I guess.
Yeah, and it's something you're trying to practice, aren't you? Through all of that, you're trying to understand and internalize, I suppose, how all those different things add up to the image that you're going to make.
And at the end of your article, you say this: I can't end this article without making 2 recommendations for further reading. Ansel Adams' book, The Camera, is a classic statement of the case for visualizing.
Yeah.
I also direct you to Michael Freeman's excellent The Photographer's Eye. Yeah. Michael Freeman is, I don't know if he's still with us, but he used to be very prolific in the sort of amateur photographer print world, and he had loads of books out there by Michael Freeman. So that's called The Photographer's Eye. I've not seen that one. And its companion books, The Photographer's Vision and Mind. Freeman does a fine job of breaking down different approaches to the frame and framing, and does so with clear visual examples drawn from his own considerable work.
That's the thing about those. They're really well illustrated, and they're all from his own practice. So he knows the images inside out, and he's really good at categorizing different kinds of shot. And it's you get the feeling almost that he's worked over such a long period of time that he's able to he's got set types of image that he's looking for, because he's practiced this business of visualizing so much, and he distills all that experience and gives it to the reader. It's really nice.
Well, our listeners, I'll put notes to those books in the show notes together with some others that I've got on my bookshelf, which I just couldn't quite remember the titles to.
Yeah. And he does make a really good point, actually, because I think he talks about how there's a lot of writing about photography that is very kind of theory based, but not based on practice. And he's trying to kind of fill this void about writing more from a kind of practical point of view, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Great stuff.
Yeah.
Simon?
Don't really have anything to add on this one.
I'm running out of steam.
I think you pretty much covered that one pretty conclusively there.
Yeah.
And I think actually on that theme, I think we're actually need to bring things to an end now. And I've got to say, I think it's been fantastic. I know a little bit more about the zone system.
But Richard, he'll keep asking guest after guest.
It's one of those things where you've got to keep going over the same stuff and until it sinks and it's that kind of thing.
And that's it. I mean, Andrew started, and then with various guests trying to give me some knowledge, and Matt Marash took me a bit further. I've got to give a special thank you to Hamish Gill, who doesn't do large format, and he doesn't consider himself to be any kind of an expert on the zone system, but he explained a couple of things to me that helped me make a bit more sense of it as well. And you've taken me further down that road as well. Well,
you did say you had a eureka moment. Was that when we were talking about zones in developing, the N+1,
the falling of the highlights? Yeah,
exactly. That was really, really good, because that at that point that made sense. But sometimes you get told to do things, well, such as, what did you meter the highlights? And the answer was no. And that was, I didn't meter the highlights because I didn't know why I'd want to meter the highlights, because I don't care too much about the highlights. I want this bit here to be black. Well, I do care about the highlights, and what's going on in the developing processes could have will have a significant effect on it. Depending upon how far those highlights are away from your shadows. So it's massively important, and I get it today on that part of it. So I do feel like I can go away and do something. It also is encouraging me again to try and stick to one film at the moment, and potentially
give that a go for a bit.
It's building up a bit of learning your craft, isn't it? Really,
and, absolutely.
And I think if you chop and change too much, then you may learn bits and bobs, but it's sometimes very, very difficult to put those things that you've learned together.
Yeah.
Well, I think if you'd gone to the effort to invest in large format photography, then you could logically conclude that you've taken a conscious decision to take your photography in a different way. And that would be for those reasons that we all know, for slowing down, for meditative, contemplative, thoughtful photography.
Yeah.
So why would you not then want to, understand? And then maybe you've got a view to making darkroom prints and combining the two. Then you really need to have some understanding of your materials, how highlights are affected, how shadows are affected, and you just cannot get away from, whether you call it the zone system or not.
Yeah.
You can't get away from it because it's basically sensitometry in action. How about that?
The prize is that creative control, because Simon actually had a real vision for that image. So it's about
don't big him up too much.
To kind of, well, it's the thing, isn't it? It's that. Yeah, that's the promise of it.
Well, that's. I was going to say that's something that up until going to do that photograph, again, it's this thing about coming from predominantly using digital and then being able to just take something in RAW and put it into Lightroom and move it wherever you like with the sliders. You don't have that. Well, a lot of people, you could argue, do have that same level of control, but it takes so much more skill to have that kind of level of control in a darkroom than it does ultimately with doing it digitally. And so going into and taking the photograph and thinking about the end result is new to me, because I don't worry about the end result when I'm shooting digitally, because the end result will be whatever I want it to be and whatever mood I'm in. But you don't have that luxury, and I think it's really good that you don't have that luxury, because it makes you work.
Well, you do a bit in the darkroom, and you can do. There are things you can do, but you can give yourself the best possible starting point by having that flexible negative, and then you're giving yourself wiggle room in the darkroom to then do that post production.
I guess really I'm talking about myself rather than somebody that really knows what they're doing. So it's a case of the opportunity for me to adjust the final output is far more limited than it will be for you, for instance, for the two of you. So it concentrates my mind more, because I know personally I cannot do as much with the end result. So I need to put as much effort as possible into getting into the exposure of the negative to help with the processing when it goes out into that darkroom with my limited abilities.
Yeah, fair point.
Yeah.
So on the subject of my limited abilities, let's start bringing things to a close. We always offer our guests an opportunity to do a shout out, and we rarely tell them that they're going to do that, and we just drop it on them. So, is there anybody you want to say hello to that you're going to? Who's going to be really annoyed if you don't say anything now?
I'll say hello to my wife Sharon, because
you've already given. Hello, Sharon.
Hello, Sharon.
Hello, Sharon. You've already given shout-outs to Sandeep, haven't you, and Ian Barnaby?
Yeah, and Em, and people like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, you've covered the bases there.
Yeah.
And once again, I'm going to offer you the opportunity to just let our listeners know where they can keep up with your work. I mean, you've mentioned your website, and I'll mention it now, and that's www.richardpickup.com.
Yeah.
Are there any other ways? Are there any other like social media?
Yeah, the big one is Twitter. Really, I'm on Twitter an awful lot. That's my main one. I've got some stuff on Instagram, but it's Twitter that I'll interact with people. So. And
what's your name on Twitter?
I'm Richard_Pickup, I think, at Twitter.
You know what? We'll double check that now.
I'm pretty sure.
Verification mode.
Yeah.
Oh, I do.
You don't type it, do you? Though when you're in Twitter, you don't actually.
Richard.
All the links in the show notes, I make sure they work first before I go and share them with people.
Oh, I just realised I've just tapped that into a post rather than looking for you. Where is it?
It's a strange post.
Search Twitter. Yeah, exactly. Search Twitter. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it says Richard_Pickup on Twitter. So. Those people who don't get to see the notes, they can do it that way. So that's good. Andrew, have you got any shout outs this week? Other than what you've already done, of course.
Well, I spent some time last weekend with Ruth Story. Ruth isn't a large format photographer. She's mainly Polaroid, but a lovely, thoughtful Polaroid instant artist. So I'll give a shout out to my friend Ruth. Brilliant. Ruth Story. She's Rue something on Twitter. ROO. Anyway, if you Google Ruth Story, you'll find her. I'll put a link to her work in the show notes. Okay,
and I'm gonna give a shout out to the Classic Lenses podcast, particularly because of a podcast. I mean, and this is down to the unique way we record this show. But by the time this episode goes out, then we would have made an episode of the Classic Lenses podcast with Isabel Cuadez.
Oh, yeah.
And who very recently, as in the last couple of days, has announced that she's giving up film photography and moving solely over to digital, to the point where she's sold all her film gear.
She's been on social media, sort of airing these thoughts, hasn't she, about what direction she should take? I must say, I'm very surprised to hear that.
Exactly, I was quite shocked when I saw that, and that opened up a conversation, and that one thing led to another, and she's coming on to the Classic Lenses podcast, which
interesting.
For those people that don't know too much about that, it's pretty much just about using old lenses, whether that be on digital or whether that be on film.
I thought it was a wholly film show now.
No, it's not quite, no. It's the bias is moved towards film, but it's not completely film. So we happily bounce between film and digital. So it's probably quite a good place to actually have that conversation. And so it will be delving into those reasons why she's completely moved away from one to another.
It'll be interesting if you folks can listen to Isabel being interviewed by Sunny 16 podcast a couple of years ago, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's an episode in the 70s. I can't quite, because I've been re-listening to that one recently, but I can't remember quick.
So it'll be.
It's called Chinese. Sorry, it's called Chinese Candy Torture is the name of it, but it hasn't got Isabel's name in the title. So Chinese Candy Torture is the episode in Sunday 16 to look for there.
Yeah, wow. She used to do lots of stuff with her Hasselblad and Flex body on it,
and large format.
Yeah, she's been on my. I was thinking about asking her to come on the large format photography podcast, but I know she's, with the best will in the world, and I don't take this in the way it's intended. I think she's been in a bit of a difficult spot creatively. She's a very thoughtful artist, and I think she's been questioning her artistic direction. And I've seen her posting saying, "Well, should I give up social media? What should I do?" And if you listen to the Sunny 16 interview, there's a certain amount of creative angst, I think, in the lady's life. It'll be interesting to hear.
Yeah, definitely. So her photography is absolutely wonderful. So
it is.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, well, finally, Andrew, how can people keep up with you?
Oh, I move so fast they can't possibly keep up with me. But if they're desperate to, they can find me at Warboys Snapper on Twitter. They can find me hanging out on the Facebook group, on the Large Format Photography Podcast Facebook group, which is now up to 400 people.
You could say 4 then.
4? Well, it might be 4.
Impressive numbers.
Depends if we board them with the zone system. 400. You can catch me every week on the Lenses podcast with Corey Cannon, and I'm pretty much over most media. Instagram, Warboys Snapper. Yeah, that's it really.
Okay, well, and people can get in touch with us if you want to send any questions in, like James Thorpe did earlier with 3 great questions there that's half carried the podcast or something.
They did.
Just send an email to largeformatphotographypodcast@gmail.com. Andrew's just mentioned our Facebook group. And I love our Facebook group. It's not a huge Facebook group, but it's the interaction on there I think is absolutely excellent. So thanks to all those people that are contributing on there. And I think you mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if it was on air or not, but there's a post on there by Wayne Setzer doing a video standing in front of a very big camera, doing things with it.
He's just posted that, I think, while we've been recording or just before. So what I loved when we had Wayne on the show, he was describing when we got onto the beer mat discussion. He then I instructed him to go away and put something on the Facebook group, and he did a drawing, didn't he, of how he manipulated the plane of focus to get to, which was just brilliant. I love it. So thank you again for that, Wayne.
He also commented on one of my waterfall shots where I'd used some front tilt, which took it past the point where my very small lens was able to actually project an image correctly. So it vignetted it at the top of it, and it was saying, well, you should have used rear movement, like I told you.
Yeah, do you not listen? Do you not listen?
Exactly. So, but I need that kind of interaction. So thank you for that, Wayne. I'll try and remember that next time. That's the thing. Large format photography. There's just so many different ways of making a photograph brilliant or awful.
Messing it up.
All right. So,
but we have been. The first 10 shows have been very heavily male dominated. I'll just throw that one in as well. We are working on it. We are trying to work on it. But,
we did have Rachel, so I mean we're 10%, 10% female.
Yes, 10%.
Is that within government standards?
No, I don't think we're being fully representative.
No, we must try harder, and we will. And actually, that's something about this thing about large format. It's been quite difficult to find women to come onto the Classic Lenses podcast, largely because they feel that it's too technical and so on. Whereas I think
you need to be careful. You're going to be getting hate mail here.
No. Well, this is the things that have been quoted back to me when I've asked people, and whereas we certainly in the Facebook group and in general, I think there's in percentage terms there seems to be more women in large format photography than the kind of photography that I've been in, where you're just like adapting different lenses and things like that. So hopefully we will have a high proportion of women on this podcast, certainly compared to Classic Lenses, where I think we've had one. So and they've done like 70 odd episodes. So hopefully we'll have a better hit rate on here.
There's been a lot of women on the. People are going to be shouting, you shouldn't be making these distinctions, but it's just a fact. We have had a lot of female pinhole guests on, and to be honest, there have been some of the best interviews. They're some of the most creative and thoughtful people, and we've had some just wonderful interviews with lady pinhole artists.
Absolutely. So finally, Richard, again, thank you for being a great guest.
Thanks, guys. It's been a pleasure.
As long as you've enjoyed yourself, we've enjoyed having you.
Yeah, it's a great conversation.
Absolutely. So last thing I do now is, actually I should just say places where people can find me. I'm on Twitter as Simon4. That's one word, and it's Simon with FOR at the end of it. I'm on Instagram as Simon Forster Photographic. I have a eBay shop. If you do a search on ebay.co.uk for It's Fozzy, where I sell things on there. Not much in the way of large format, unfortunately, but lots of small.
And why is that? Why is that, Simon?
Because any large format stuff that heads my way stays in my house. Simple as that. Yeah, maybe when I start duplicating gear, then I might actually start selling some of it. But one day I'll start selling more large format. Other things, we already talked about the Classic Lenses podcast. Theme music But thank you to Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com for our theme music, which is Two Fingered Johnny. And we love that music, and it's been proven that it's good because it was voted for.
We've scientifically tested it, and
it worked.
It works.
Yeah, exactly. So finally, I hope you've enjoyed the podcast this week, and it'd be great if you can join us again in a fortnight. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.